Pat Wright, Ralph Neas, and John Wodatch. Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. A project of Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, with Access Video, University of San Francisco.
I actually am really interested in, if you look historically at the movement of the civil rights movement of people with disabilities, 504 was basically given to us. The disability community did very little to kind of gain that legislation. So the real first major legislative push, other than to overturn Supreme Court decision with Grove City, was the development of the ADA. And I guess I'm really interested in, Ralph, from your perspective, the movement that you saw Congress making from looking at disability as a benefit system and, you know, changing to a civil rights system. And do you have problems in getting like the Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, to make that change?
I'm not sure. I totally agree with what you just said. The bottom line for sure. But I recall vividly the first civil rights bill I worked on was 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act when I was with Senator Brooke. And I truly cannot recall any interaction with any constituencies at all. It was Senator Harrison Williams and his staff and Senator Brooke and many others. But of course I recall vividly my own personal introduction to DREDF in 1981 in that historic conference in San Francisco, when ostensibly the civil rights community was going to San Francisco to share our knowledge and our expertise with the disability community, when in reality it was an opportunity for the disability community to teach the civil rights community, especially that disability rights were fundamental civil rights. And that for me was the line of demarcation in terms of how the Leadership Conference Civil Rights and organizations within the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights started viewing disability rights. Before that, disability issues were in the Health Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Shortly after that 1981 conference, there was no more Health Task Force, and we started treating disability rights the way we would treat minority rights or gender issues or many other kinds of issues. And then you might remember the very first thing we worked on was the voter accessibility bill with people with disabilities and senior citizens. And there were a whole series of issues: the Civil Rights Restoration Act, the voter accessibility bill, the 3 Supreme Court decisions, the Fair Housing Bill, where more and more and more the disability community was becoming part of the general civil rights community and were perceived as equal partners with equally important issues. And the disability community was working on other civil rights issues, other civil rights organizations working with the disability community. So by the time you, Pat, brought the Americans with Disabilities Act to the Executive Committee of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights in 1988, the foundation had been laid, the alliances had been forged. Leadership Conference was on record for saying disability rights are fundamental civil rights, and instead of saying this is not something we can do, everyone wanted to do it. They wanted to know the details, but we immediately got a consensus of the entire civil rights community to work on behalf of the most radical, far-reaching, transforming, most important civil rights legislation since the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
But Ralph, that's a long way. You know, granted the LCCR endorsed it, but, you know, to be honest with you, without, and you haven't paid me any money, but, you know, without your leadership in making that happen in Congress, it would never have happened. That your role for me was critical, you know, with the flag of LCCR, but your personal relationships of changing the members of Congress to think of disability as a civil rights issue and not as a benefit. And I think, you know, that was one of the critical junctures, as it was with you, John, with the administration, to, and I guess I'm still unclear, do you think the administration ever did think of this as a civil rights issue?
See, I don't know if they did. Individuals certainly didn't.
Right.
Many of them, and I think that may be true in the civil rights groups as well. They see it as a civil rights issue, but they don't truly see it the same way they see race as a civil rights issue. But I think in terms, there was a history. I think Ralph is right. There was a history building up, first with 504. 504 is always talked about there with Title IX of the Education Amendments, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of '64. So you think of them together. They're civil rights laws. You have social scientists talking about a paradigm shift, if anyone knows what that is. And so you have all of that thinking, and so there's a general perception that it's civil rights. Whether someone really understands that viscerally or intuitively or gets it, that this is civil rights and that people with disabilities are affected in the same way when they are denied access to a program in a building. It's not just the denial of that. It says something about what it does to their own self-image and what it does to them in society. Although I don't know if people got that at the time.
So, but when you were like dealing with the various people in the administrations, like Sununu, who I don't think ever got it, Boyden, who got it, I'm not sure what he got, but he got something.
No, but he was very committed to this. I mean, I think part of it was that, especially for that whole group of people, was that the president, when he was a presidential candidate, President Bush on the campaign trail, endorsed it. And as much as getting it, it was, this is something that our boss said he was going to do. We're going to show that he's a great leader by getting it done. Well, that affected as many people as anything else.
I explained that Bush was really in trouble with the kinder, gentler phrasing, and this was the first piece of legislation that they can wrap around and say it was kinder, gentler. And that's how we got that endorsement. But I'm really, when we went up to the Hill with this, you had members who never thought of disability as a civil rights issue. I mean, what did you do to try and change that? And do you think it was just that relationship, with LCCR that made members say, oh, well, they're a part of LCCR, so this is a civil rights issue? Because I don't think that's true, I'll tell you.
I'm not sure there's an easy way to answer that question. Again, I do believe that the work that was done between 81 and 88 and 89 was truly important. The Civil Rights Restoration Act did involve remedying Title VI of the '64 Civil Rights Act, Title IX of the Education Act, the Age Discrimination Act, as well as Section 504. And you and I have discussed about this many times. Perhaps the best thing that happened during those 7 or 8 years was that the coalition decided to help all 4 constituencies address all 4 civil rights statutes and see these as 4 civil rights statutes,
so
including
is your theory, though, there wouldn't be an ADA then if there wasn't Brad Reynolds?
I don't think there would have been an ADA if there had not been these previous legislative successes, if there hadn't been previous examples of all elements of the civil rights community working together and laying the foundation for the Americans with Disabilities Act, not just with the 180 organizations in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, but with the press, with the grassroots constituencies, and very importantly, with the key members of Congress. Not all members of Congress. In the end, I'm not sure how many of our 90% of the House of Representatives and the Senate knew or thought that disability rights equaled civil rights, but the key civil rights leaders, Ham Fish, Don Edwards, Ted Kennedy, Tom Harkin, Steny Hoyer, said from the pulpit, this is a civil rights issue, and that's how we won.
Yes, I think another part of that process is the power of stories. Judy Heumann standing before a subcommittee and the Senate and the House saying what happened to her, that I was viewed as a barrier and what that did to her. I think there was testimony from someone who was a Vietnam veteran, came home and was supposed to do physical therapy, couldn't use his swimming pool. Those kinds of stories, I think, speak to members of Congress, spoke to people in the administration, and they were parallel to what they knew civil rights was about. And and Justin Dart coming with the diaries from all 50 states, so that there was example after example of people being denied services, being affected by that denial. That linked this to the debate on Title VI. It linked it to the civil rights area.
This is really important. I think all of us who've worked on civil rights issues and prepared for hearings or prepared for press conferences, we always say, whether it's disability issues or any other kind of civil rights issue, where are the witnesses who can bring a personal story to the table, the anecdotal witnesses, the victims of discrimination? And it's always a powerful story, and it can move members of Congress or the administration or the press or the public. A very important point, though, that goes along with this point is that I do believe a number of members of the administration, members of Congress, and many others were much more comfortable with disability because it was in their family. I also think, quite frankly, that it was perceived as a very good issue politically, that because it did affect every household in the entire nation. It wasn't like that controversial Civil Rights Act of 1990, which became a quota bill and became a race issue and very controversial. This one, which was much more radical in terms of what it would do positively for this country, was passed with 90-something% majorities, and George Bush vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1990 while championing the Americans with Disabilities Act.
There was an attempt to paint this bill that same way, either with drug addicts, alcoholics, people who are HIV positive in restaurants. I mean, all of those. But it was such a vocal minority and fringe minority of people trying to do it that I think it maybe even isolated that. But there was an attempt to try and do it. It just didn't resonate with the rest of Congress.
The politics were different.
If we had affirmative action language in the bill, do you think we could have made it through?
It could have been much more difficult. Obviously,
I think in the administration they would have made it, because the whole, I mean, the concept of, first of all, parallelism, giving to, in terms of non-discrimination, giving to people with disabilities the same protections that federal civil rights laws gave to other people was very powerful.
But yet we have affirmative action for race and gender, and we don't have that in the ADA.
You couldn't pass it now, and it's not popular. I mean, people are trying to get rid of it now. And they're actually, you know, we do have some affirmative action. Section 503 does have affirmative action, but it's just, I think it would be radically different, because the other part for the administration was that you had Section 504, and this was really taking the concepts of Section 504 and applying them more broadly, applying them across huge sectors of the American, the face of America that weren't covered, but they were familiar to them in a rough sense. It was familiar to their staffs, at any rate.
What was
I think John, this conclusion is correct. I do think it would in part depend on how the language was structured. Certainly getting disparate impact through the same Congress with the Civil Rights Act of 1990-91 was an important achievement. But consistent with John, having the Civil Rights Act of 1991 on the table at the very same time the Americans with Disabilities Act was on the table would have complicated immeasurably the prospects for passage. So I think the decision not to do that was a wise one, and I'm not sure we would have gotten the Americans with Disabilities Act quite so promptly and with so much bipartisan support.
So was there any point in time from the administration, for you with your ear to the administration and you with your ear to Congress, that you really felt like we're not going to make it?
I think for me that was early on. I mean, I think before, no. Once it was introduced in the period of July to August, after Dick Thornburgh testified and said the administration's in favor of these concepts, but we have a few issues we want to talk. Actually getting the whole administration to agree to the negotiated bill that came out of that was a much bigger step than you may have realized from the outside. I mean, there were certainly people. I mean, you had Dick Thornburgh, you had Boyd and Gray, you had the right people together pushing it, but you still had John Sununu, who was very responsive to people in the House. You still had some concern about how far-reaching was this bill, and are we doing the right thing? And not until that August agreement that, all right, we're going to support this bill, did I have a sense that it was actually going to happen.
John's absolutely right. August 3rd, 1989 was by far the most important moment. And Dick Thornburgh will always have my undying thanks on that, particularly since the day before we defeated his assistant attorney for civil rights nominee. So he was not in a particularly good mood. But I'll never forget, he had several of his key aides with John. I think Grace Mustelle and Marianne
Mustelle,
McGettigan
right.
for the White House, working with you and Bobby and myself and many others. That was one of the most memorable events I've ever come across. That little Capitol hearing room off the Senate floor, which was so small that we could only get about 30 or 40 people in there, and
The
seeing
Mansfield room.
a unanimous vote, even Senator Hatch joining in on that vote, 16-0 out of committee. I knew we had a law. It might take another year, but I knew we had a law. But it would not have happened in certainly as strong a bill or as bipartisan a bill if that 6 weeks of negotiation had not worked out. And Thornburg and his staff did a tremendous job.
I guess, is there a high...
What's your answer to that question?
I actually thought the Chapman Amendment was going to be the downfall of the bill.
Did you really?
Well, I never had that.
I didn't think that either.
That's interesting.
I thought the congressional amendment was probably more troublesome to me because members of Congress started really realizing what was in the bill. And they said, you mean this is going to apply to me and I'd have to do that?
I have to hire people with disabilities, right?
I for some reason, I thought the Chapman Amendment and the way it sort of worked out, I didn't have the same
Chapman Amendment
sense.
for me was really the emperor in the clothes issue, which is we had President Bush on record at World AIDS Day saying that you can't get AIDS from food handlers. We have it in writing. We have the Restaurant Association booklet about saying you can't get AIDS from food handling. And we have amendments on the floor and the White House being nowhere. The White House totally abandoning the ship. We didn't have the votes. We lost in the House. We had to do some quick maneuvering, as you remember. And I do, for me, when I said at the press conference that, this had to be resolved or we pull the bill down, that was true for me. It was really a pensive moment because all along we had maintained that we couldn't let, pieces of the group fall off. And that was the real first challenge that we had. I mean, the mental illness thing came earlier, but everybody kind of stayed on that one. But AIDS was such a new disability, all the homophobia that existed in the disability community about not wanting to embrace AIDS, and then all of a sudden, this major piece,
But in the administration, I think there was still, keep in mind that in the campaign, Bush sort of separated himself from a lot of people by endorsing the Watkins Commission and being in favor of civil rights legislation, dealing with people who are HIV positive. I think that was too clever. They weren't going to let this go down over that eventually. I mean, it was a way to keep
I felt very alone on the floor.
No, and I remember not being able to get anyone to assist.
I remember standing in that little phone booth off the House floor, screaming at Boyden and screaming at anyone I could get a hold of on the phone, saying, "Where are you? What are you doing? What are you doing?" And then losing the vote. Yeah.
I remember that phone booth as well. Because I was calling people saying, "What are we doing? What are we doing?"
What is our position? Ralph, anything for you which you thought, we're going to lose it over this one?
No, in all honesty, after August 3rd of 1989, I never had a doubt.
And see, I also thought after the Hoyer-Bartlett negotiations and compromise in the House, because Bartlett had such a good reputation with the conservatives, that the fact that he had worked on it, made it better from their perspective and passable, I thought that there were going to be glitches, there were going to be some problems, but I didn't think there would be anything
What did
that
they
would
think of
derail
the
that.
disability lobby?
Well, this was going on. I mean, we always saw the people from the disability community as this aggressive force that was very organized. If some congressman said something negative in the morning, that afternoon, a disability rights organization from his district would call. And the same thing would happen with the administration. There would be lobbying at key points with the right people. It couldn't have been as easy as it looked. I mean, I don't even know how you managed to keep people together on, like the Chapman Amendment or other issues, with the notion that we're all going to be in this together instead of just saying, hey, this is a good bill for us, let's get rid of them.
I don't think we could ever again create that coalition. When you have old friend of mine used to quote Janis Joplin when you got nothing to lose. There was no civil rights in the private sector unless you received federal financial assistance, except in a few states where there was some organized, state law. So when you have nothing, it's easier to keep that coalition together. I think if, the ADA came under a serious attack at this point, we could probably, if it was the sake of losing it all, if it only came out as picking off one group or another group, it would be much harder to hold the coalition together, because people don't want to give up what they already have. They don't want to lay that on the line and risk that. So I think, people, want to give a lot of credit, but I don't think it took a lot of time. I don't think it was that big of a deal, to be honest with you.
It looked like a big deal from the other side. I think you're being I think it's a big deal.
I think Pat is tremendously underestimating the force of her personality, the force of her leadership, her strategic sense, and why everyone in the disability community and the civil rights community called her the general of the effort to enact the Americans with Disabilities Act. There were dozens, hundreds of organizations in the disability community and the general civil rights community who worked on this bill and had a very, very sophisticated strategy, whether it was a press strategy, a grassroots strategy, an advocacy strategy, the research and policy strategy, and Pat knew when to deploy her forces. If there was something bad happening, there was someone on the news, or there was someone chained to the offices of the person who had said something incorrect or absurd earlier that day. We used the DAP. The DAP was always on the cutting edge.
Remember when a DAP
took over Jack Brooks's committee room, and I had to go in and negotiate for hours.
It's like the stars had lined up in a certain way, and I don't think, just right now we're dealing with hate crimes. Hatch, who is a leader on disability issues for years, doesn't want to amend the hate crimes bill to include people with disabilities. So, I'm looking 10 years later, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of ADA, and we still can't see it as a civil rights issue. So, it's another battle all again.
Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. Producer, Phyllis Ward, Access Video. Interviewers, Phyllis Ward and Mary Lou Breslin. Post-production, editing, captions, audio description, Dave Newell. Stewardship, promotion, distribution, Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. Mary Lou Breslin, Susan Henderson. Special thanks goes to both the sung and the unsung heroes who worked tirelessly to make the Americans with Disabilities Act a reality. The Disability Rights Leadership Series owes a debt of gratitude to the individuals who agreed to be interviewed and without whose passion and dedication the ADA would not have become law. The series would not have come about without the vision of Pat Wright, longtime Director of Governmental Affairs for DREDF, and Arlene Mayerson, DREDF's directing attorney, who conceptualized the series and the interview themes. Thanks goes to the University of San Francisco for sponsoring the project that included the Disability Rights Leadership Series, and the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, for accepting an archival copy of the unedited interviews and providing a safe and permanent home for the collection. The series would not have been possible without funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. A list of the interviewees and links to their interviews can be found at dredf.org. 2015.